On the surface, Lana Turner was the immaculate fantasy of American cinema, a blonde deity bathed in the blinding glare of studio lights. But in the dark, that deity belonged to Howard Hughes, an apex predator who did not write love letters. He wired microphones into her bedroom walls. This was never a romance. It was a corporate hostage situation bleeding out in plain sight, proving that behind the glittering facade of Hollywood is a slaughterhouse. And the price of fame is absolute suffocating submission. Before the magnetic surveillance tapes and the political rod of Watergate, they ruled two distinct empires that should have never collided. They were separated by a chasm of incurable paranoia, but doomed to a violent intersection that would dismantle a woman and eventually bring the American presidency to its knees. The Hollywood studio system of the 1950s was already a machine designed to strip women of their autonomy. Studio bosses owned their stars. They dictated their weights, their hairstyles, their marriages, and their morals. Actresses were property, bound by contracts that penalized them for getting pregnant or aging, but Hughes took this corporate ownership and weaponized it with the precision of an aerospace engineer. He snorts looked at the existing studio system and found it sloppy. A contract was just a piece of paper. It could be broken. It could be renegotiated. Hughes did not want a contract. He wanted total, uninterrupted, omnipresent control. When Hughes first set his sights on Lana Turner, she was at the height of her power. She was the blonde bombshell, the ultimate symbol of cinematic glamour. Men desired her. Women wanted to be her. She walked through the world surrounded by an entourage of handlers, publicists, and admirers. To a normal man, this level of fame is intimidating. To Hughes, it was a security breach. He viewed her social circle the same way a defense contractor views a porous border. There were too many variables, too many people who could influence her, talk to her, or take her away. His approach was not a courtship, it was a siege. He deployed his vast capital as a blunt instrument to crush her perimeter. He did not send flowers. He sent private airplanes. If she mentioned wanting to travel, a Lockheed Constellation would be fueled and waiting on the runway before she finished her sentence. If she attended a party, he ensured a diamond necklace was delivered to her dressing room the next morning. These were not romantic gestures. They were collars. The sheer financial weight of his attention was designed to be paralyzing. How do you say no to a man who can buy the building you are standing in without checking his bank balance? How do you reject a man whose companies employ tens of thousands of people, a man who regularly meets with senators and generals? Turner accepted the gifts. She accepted the flights. She thought she was engaging in the traditional commerce of Hollywood royalty. She her company for his generosity. She did not realize she was walking into a holding pen. The isolation began slowly. It started with convenience. Hughes offered her a driver. It seemed like a luxury, a way to avoid the aggressive paparazzi. The driver was in fact the first layer of the surveillance grid. He logged her mileage, noted her destinations, and recorded the names of anyone who got into the car. He reported directly to Hughes' security chief at the end of every shift. Then came the domestic staff. Hughes casually suggested that her current maid was inefficient and offered to pay for a replacement from his own trusted staff. The new maid systematically searched Turner's trash, read her mail, and cataloged the contents of her medicine cabinet. Hughes was mapping her life. He needed to understand the mechanics of her daily existence before he could dismantle it. Turner began pulling the curtain shut in broad daylight. She hesitated before speaking on her own telephone, anticipating the faint hiss of the magnetic reel engaging. The driver always seemed to know her destination before she announced it. The new maid lingered a fraction of a second too long when the phone rang. The studio goddess had become a prisoner in her own sanctuary. On the studio lot, she was a goddess, bathed in the blinding light of arc lamps, her face projected 50 ft high on silver screens across the globe. Inside her own home, she felt a creeping, inexplicable chill. She felt the gaze. She would close the curtains and still feel exposed. Hughes did not act out of passion. His jealousy was cold, clinical, and logistical. When Turner went out with friends, Hughes did not sit at home drinking and throwing glass against the wall. He picked up a telephone and dispatched operatives. He hired private investigation firms, not by the hour, but by the year. He bought exclusivity. He demanded that these agencies put their best men on the Turner detail, men who knew how to blend into the background at high-end Restora. And TS, men who knew how to bribe a maitre d' to get a table within earshot of her booth. He systematized the surveillance. He created a bureaucracy of stalking. Reports were typed up in triplicate. They detailed what she wore, what she ate, how many drinks she consumed, and exactly what time she returned home. Hughes would sit in his darkened office reading these reports with the intensity of a man studying enemy troop movements. If a man looked at her for too long at a party, Hughes did not confront the man. He had his investigators pull the man's background file, check his bank records, and look for vulnerabilities. The wiretap in the brass lamp was the escalation. Human intelligence is flawed. Private detectives can fall asleep. Maids can be fired. Hughes needed a direct, unfiltered feed into her sanctuary. He hired technicians who normally worked on classified government contracts to bypass the local telephone exchange. They spliced into the physical copper wires leading to her house. They planted microphones in the living room, the dining room, and the bedroom. Turner would lie awake at night staring at the ceiling, feeling an oppressive weight pressing down on her chest. She had the diamonds. She had the fame. She had the undivided attention of the richest man in the country, and yet she was suffocating. She would pick up the telephone to call a friend just to hear a voice that did not belong to the studio or to Hughes. Sometimes, before the dial tone clicked in, she could hear a faint hiss on the line, a slight crackle of static. She would dismiss it as bad wiring. She did not understand the physics of the trap she was in. She did not know that her voice was being recorded onto reel-to-reel magnetic tape, transcribed by secretaries sworn to secrecy, and delivered to a man who viewed human interaction as an engineering problem to be solved. The apparatus Hughes built around Lana Turner was unprecedented in the private sector. It was an intelligence-gathering operation that rivaled the capabilities of a mid-sized nation-state. He was testing the limits of what money could buy. He discovered that money could buy the total erosion of a human being's privacy. He discovered that with enough cash you could turn an entire city into a panopticon where everyone from the valet to the bartender was a potential informant. Hughes recognized the efficiency of this model. Physical force was messy. Information dominance was absolute. With the wiretaps active and the bribes holding, he possessed a complete architectural map of her life. As Hughes sat in his screening room listening to the playback of her private conversations, his ambition shifted. The Hollywood studio system was too small. The real power was in Washington, D.C., the Cold War was freezing the globe, and the United States government was desperate for the kind of advanced technology Hughes' aircraft was developing. Hughes realized a terrifying truth. The tactics he perfected on a single actress could be scaled. They could be applied to a much more lucrative target, the American political establishment. The Hollywood experiment was over. The true operation was about to begin. The transition from Hollywood producer to global intelligence broker did not happen overnight. It was a slow, creeping infection of ambition fueled by an unchecked, bottomless bank account. The real currency of the mid-20th century was not celluloid. It was uranium, titanium, and information. The Cold War had descended upon the globe like an iron curtain, and the United States government was terrified of what was lurking in the dark. Hughes thrived in the dark. He understood fear better than any general or politician because he lived with it every second of his waking life. He saw the paranoia gripping Washington and recognized it as a business opportunity. Hughes Aircraft Company ceased to be a mere aviation firm. It morphed into a defense contracting behemoth, an impenetrable fortress of applied sciences and classified research. Hughes was no longer just building airplanes to break speed records. He was building the nervous system of the American military. He was manufacturing the radar systems that tracked incoming Soviet bombers. He was developing the air-to-air missiles that would defend the skies. He was designing the satellites that would soon look down on the entire planet. As the contracts from the Pentagon multiplied, the volume of classified material flowing through his companies became staggering. With classified material came the justification for extreme uncompromising security. The shift in his focus required a shift in his personnel. The private detectives and studio fixers who had stalked Lana Turner through the restaurants of Beverly Hills were obsolete. They were street-level thugs with cameras. Hughes now required men who understood the architecture of a shadow state. He needed men who knew how to topple foreign governments, how to launder ungodly sums of cash across national borders, and how to operate entirely outside the boundaries of the United States Constitution. He stopped hiring from the ranks of retired police officers and began poaching directly from the apex of the federal intelligence community. He wanted the best spies the government had ever trained, and he was willing to pay them salaries that made their government pensions look like pocket change. The crown jewel of this new recruitment drive was a man named Robert Maheu. Maheu was a seasoned intelligence operative. He had started his career in the Federal Bureau of Investigation hunting down Nazi saboteurs during the Second World War. He had transitioned into the Central Intelligence Agency, operating as a freelance fixer for the agency's most sensitive, deniable operations. Maheu was the man the CIA called when they needed something done that could never be traced back to Langley. He was the man who had famously been tasked by the CIA to hire the mafia to assassinate Fidel Castro. Mayhew understood the mechanics of power, corruption, and absolute secrecy. Hughes recognized a kindred spirit in Mayhew, albeit one who could comfortably operate in the daylight. As Hughes retreated further into his own psychological darkness, locking himself in sterile hotel penthouses and refusing to see the sun, Mayhew became his avatar. Mayhew became the physical manifestation of Hughes in the outside world. He was the voice on the other end of the telephone, the man who executed the billionaire's increasingly erratic and grandiose commands. The strategy was chilling in its simplicity. Hughes instructed Mayhew to take the exact same tactics of manipulation, surveillance, and financial dominance that had been perfected on Hollywood starlets and apply them to the political establishment. Hughes realized that politicians were remarkably similar to actors. They were driven by vanity, insecure about their status, and constantly in need of funding to maintain their positions. To Hughes, a United States senator was just a different kind of leading man, and leading men could be bought. Hughes did not care about political ideology. He did not care about the differences between Democrats and Republicans. He viewed the American political system as a machine, and he believed that every machine had a price tag. He instructed his shadow army to begin funneling cash into campaign coffers across the country. This was not transparent corporate lobbying. This was dark money. Suitcases filled with untraceable $100 bills were handed over in underground parking garages and secluded hotel rooms. Hughes wanted to own a voting bloc in Congress just like he owned sound stages in Hollywood. The goal was to create a political buffer zone around his empire. If a regulatory agency started asking questions about his airline monopolies, a senator on the Hughes payroll would quietly kill the inquiry. If the Pentagon considered awarding a lucrative missile contract to a rival defense firm, a congressman beholden to Hughes would ensure that it was reversed. He was weaponizing his wealth to construct a reality where the laws of the United States simply did not apply to him. He was privatizing the government. The surveillance techniques were upgraded to match the new targets. The wiretaps that had once captured the tears of actresses were now deployed to capture the indiscretions of lawmakers. Hughes' private intelligence network gathered dossiers on the men running the country. They cataloged their mistresses, their gambling debts, and their secret vices. Hughes understood that a bribe was only a temporary lease on a man's loyalty. Blackmail was a permanent deed of ownership. He built a vault of secrets, a leverage machine that ensured that when Howard Hughes asked for a favor, the answer was always yes. This unprecedented concentration of private power eventually caught the attention of the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA did not view Hughes as a threat. They viewed him as the ultimate asset. The agency was constrained by congressional oversight, by budgets, and by the geopolitical necessity of plausible deniability. Hughes was constrained by nothing. He had unlimited funds, a massive industrial base, and a security apparatus that rivaled their own. The line between the United States government and the Hughes empire began to dissolve. They became symbiotic organisms feeding off each other's secrets. The climax of this unholy alliance occurred in the deep waters of the Pacific Ocean. In the late 1960s, a Soviet submarine designated K-129 suffered a catastrophic failure and sank to the bottom of the ocean. It was carrying nuclear ballistic missiles and the most advanced cryptographic equipment in the Soviet arsenal. The United States military desperately wanted to examine the wreckage. It was an intelligence goldmine that could shift the balance of the Cold War. The problem was the depth. The submarine lay 3 miles beneath the surface, far beyond reach of any conventional salvage technology. Moreover, any attempt by the United States Navy to recover the vessel would be an act of war if discovered by the Soviets. The CIA needed a cover story. They needed a civilian operation so massive, so technologically audacious, and so shrouded in corporate secrecy that it could camouflage a military salvage mission. There was only one man on Earth capable of providing such a front. The CIA went to Howard Hughes. They did not subpoena him, they requested an audience. They asked the billionaire to lend his name and his companies to one of the most highly classified operations in the history of espionage, code-named Project Azorian. Hughes agreed. He relished the opportunity. It fed his ultimate delusion of grandeur. He was no longer just building weapons for the military. He was actively participating in the shadow war against the Soviet Union. He was operating on a level above the president, dealing directly with the directors of intelligence. The Hughes organization publicly announced that the billionaire was expanding his empire into deep-sea mining. They claimed he was building a revolutionary vessel designed to harvest manganese nodules from the ocean floor. It was a brilliant, plausible lie. It fit perfectly with Hughes's reputation as a visionary eccentric who funded impossible technological leaps. The ship they built was a Leviathan. It was named the Hughes Glamour Explorer. It was a marvel of engineering, a massive floating platform designed specifically to lower a giant mechanical claw 3 miles into the abyss, grab the whole of the Soviet submarine, and drag it up into a hidden enclosed moon pool inside the ship's belly. The entire operation cost hundreds of millions of dollars, funded by black-budget CIA money, but shielded by the corporate veil of the Hughes empire. For years, the Glamour Explorer operated under the guise of commercial enterprise. Soviet spy ships would shadow the vessel, watching the massive derricks and listening to the grinding machinery, completely unaware that directly beneath the ship a mechanical arm was reaching into the darkness to steal their nuclear secrets. The sheer audacity of the operation was staggering. It required thousands of engineers, sailors, and technicians to maintain absolute silence. Hughes never set foot on the ship. He was locked away in a hotel penthouse in Las Vegas, surrounded by blackout curtains and boxes of Kleenex. His body wasting away from malnutrition and drug addiction, clear his throat, yet his name was the magic spell that made the operation possible. He was the ultimate human shield for the American intelligence community. The government used his reputation for madness to hide their own audacious sanity. This was the peak of the macro-level surveillance state Hughes had constructed. He had successfully merged his private paranoia with the national security apparatus of a superpower. He had men like Robert Maheu executing orders that blurred the line between corporate strategy and international espionage. The same network that had once been tasked with finding out who Lana Turner was having dinner with was now tasked with lifting a nuclear submarine off the ocean floor. The scale had changed, but the fundamental mechanics of control remained identical. However, a machine built on secrets, bribery, and blackmail is inherently unstable. The massive amounts of dark money flowing out of the Hughes casinos in Las Vegas and into the pockets of politicians across the country created a highly pressurized environment. Hughes was buying influence at a frantic pace, terrified that someone, somewhere was plotting to dismantle his empire. He demanded absolute loyalty from the politicians he funded, treating them with the same ruthless contempt he had shown the actors on his movie sets. The paranoia was no longer a personal psychological defect. It was an institutional reality. The Hughes empire had become a rogue state within the United States. It had its own foreign policy, its own intelligence agency, and its own treasury. It operated with impunity, crushing rivals, buying legislation, and hiding behind walls of corporate lawyers and ex-spies. But the fatal flaw in any system of absolute control is the illusion that every variable can be accounted for. Hughes believed he could manage the fallout of his political bribes. He believed that the men he bought would stay bought. He did not account for the paranoia of the men he was bribing. He did not realize that by injecting millions of dollars of untraceable cash into the highest levels of the American political system, he was creating a contagion. The culture of wiretapping, espionage, and political sabotage that he had fostered was about to break containment. The epicenter of this impending disaster was not in Las Vegas, nor was it in Hollywood. The epicenter was moving toward a complex of office buildings on the banks of the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. The dark money that Hughes had used to construct his shadow empire was about to collide with the political ambitions of a man who was every bit as ruthless, calculating, and fearful as Hughes himself. The techniques of the Hollywood casting couch and the private investigator's wiretap were about to be deployed against the democratic process itself. The bill for decades of unchecked corporate espionage was coming due, and the currency of payment would be the destruction of the American presidency. The architecture of a shadow state requires two specific elements to function. It requires limitless capital, and it requires profound, incurable paranoia. By the late 1960s, Howard Hughes possessed more of both than any man on the planet. But he was not alone. Across the country, sitting behind the resolute desk in the Oval Office, was a man who operated on the exact same psychological frequency. President Richard Nixon was a man under siege. He did not look out the windows of the White House and see a nation he governed. He saw a landscape of enemies waiting to destroy him. Nixon and Hughes never met face-to-face during this period. They did not need to. They communicated through the shared language of extortion, illegal wiretaps, and untraceable cash. They were twin architects of a disaster that would bring the American government to its knees. Hughes was rotting in a hotel penthouse in Las Vegas. He had purchased the Desert Inn. He had purchased the sands. He had purchased the Castaways, the Frontier, and the Silver Slipper. He was buying the Las Vegas Strip building by building. This aggressive expansion triggered bells in Washington. The Antitrust Division of the United States Justice Department began drafting injunctions. They prepared to block Hughes from establishing a total monopoly over the gambling capital of the world. A normal corporate entity would deploy a battalion of lawyers to argue the merits of the case in federal court. Hughes did not believe in courts. He believed that the judicial system was merely a marketplace with higher prices. He decided to bypass the Justice Department entirely. He decided to buy the President of the United States. The method of the transaction was remarkably primitive. It stripped away all the polite fictions of corporate lobbying. Hughes did not write a check to a campaign committee. He demanded a direct physical transfer of cash. The amount was $100,000. The money was pulled directly from the counting rooms of the Silver Slipper Casino. It was untraceable. It was stacked, banded, and placed into a briefcase. Hughes instructed his chief fixer, Robert Maheu, to handle the logistics. Maheu, the former FBI agent who treated international espionage and domestic bribery with the same cold efficiency, dispatched a courier. The courier was Richard Danner, another former FBI man who had seamlessly transitioned into the Hughes syndicate. Danner carried the briefcase out of Nevada. His destination was not the White House. The drop needed to be insulated. Danner traveled to Florida to meet a man named Charles Rebozo. Everyone called him Baby. Rebozo was a banker, a real estate speculator, and Richard Nixon's absolute closest confidant. Rebozo functioned as the president's vault. Danner handed the briefcase to Rebozo. Rebozo took the $100,000 in illicit casino cash and locked it inside a safety deposit box in Key Biscayne. The money sat in the dark. It did not generate interest. It generated leverage. Hughes had successfully planted a financial bomb inside the president's inner circle. The Justice Department suddenly, and without clear legal explanation, dropped its antitrust objections. Hughes was permitted to continue his monopolization of Las Vegas. The bribe had worked flawlessly. Hughes had proven that the commander-in-chief was just another asset that could be acquired for the right price. But the nature of dark money is volatile. It leaves a residue. It creates witnesses. A secret of that magnitude cannot be contained indefinitely, especially when the men holding the secret are professional operatives trained to exploit vulnerabilities. This is where the structure of the Hughes empire became its own fatal liability. Hughes did not trust anyone. He compartmentalized his operations. He pitted his executives against one another to ensure no single man amassed enough power to challenge him. Robert Maheu ran the Nevada operations, but Maheu was constantly fighting off rivals within the Hughes corporate structure in California. To fortify his own position, Maheu hired external consultants. He hired men with deep political connections to act as buffers and lobbyists for the Hughes organization in Washington. One of the men Maheu hired was Larry O'Brien. O'Brien was a political heavyweight. He was a master strategist. He had served in the cabinets of John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson. He knew the back channels of Washington better than anyone. Maheu put O'Brien on a massive retainer. O'Brien's firm was paid $15,000 a month by the Hughes Tool Company. His job was to manage the political fallout of Hughes's endless legal battles and to ensure that the federal government remained compliant. O'Brien became intimately familiar with the inner workings of the Hughes machine. He read the internal memos. He understood the flow of the money. He knew about the aggressive tactics, the private investigators, and the utter disregard for federal foul law. True. O'Brien was a mercenary. He took the money and did the work, but the relationship eventually soured. The Hughes organization was a chaotic nightmare. Hughes himself was firing off erratic, paranoid directives from his penthouse, demanding impossible political favors. O'Brien cut his ties with the Hughes empire. He walked away from the retainer. He returned to the front line of national politics. By 1972, Larry O'Brien had ascended to the top of the opposition. He was named the chairman of the Democratic National Committee. He was the man tasked with defeating Richard Nixon in the upcoming presidential election. The elevation of Larry O'Brien triggered a catastrophic psychological chain reaction inside the White House. Nixon was sitting in the Oval Office surrounded by his own secret recording devices. He had ordered the installation of a voice-activated taping system to capture every conversation, every whisper, every threat made in his presence. He was building his own private panopticon, mirroring the exact methodology Hughes had used for decades. Nixon trusted no one. He viewed the press as an enemy combatant. He viewed the anti-war protesters as a domestic insurgency. But most of all, he feared the secrets in his own closet. Nixon knew about the $100,000 sitting in Bebe Rebozo's safety deposit box. He knew it was illegal. He knew it was an impeachable offense. It was a direct violation of campaign finance laws, and it carried the distinct stench of a quid pro quo for the Las Vegas antitrust settlement. If the press found out about the Hughes cash, the Nixon presidency would collapse overnight. Then Nixon looked across the political battlefield and saw Larry O'Brien leading the Democratic charge. The president's paranoia synthesized these two facts into a nightmare of imminent destruction. Nixon knew that O'Brien used to work for Hughes. He knew that O'Brien was closely tied to Robert Maheu. Nixon concluded with absolute certainty that Larry O'Brien knew about the briefcase full of cash. There was no hard evidence to support this conclusion. O'Brien was likely unaware of the specific physical transfer of the $100,000 to Rebozo. The Hughes operation was highly compartmentalized, but evidence does not matter to a paranoid mind. Fear dictates reality. Nixon convinced himself that O'Brien was sitting on a mountain of Hughes documents. He convinced himself that O'Brien was waiting for the perfect moment late in the election cycle to drop the Hughes bombshell and destroy Nixon's chances of re-election. Clear's throat, the panic infected the highest levels of the administration. Nixon summoned his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman. He summoned his domestic policy chief, John Ehrlichman. He demanded intelligence. He demanded to know exactly what O'Brien possessed. The President of the United States was operating under the assumption that a rival political chairman was holding blackmail material generated by an eccentric billionaire. The White House could not use the FBI to investigate O'Brien. The FBI was a massive bureaucracy. It leaked. It required warrants. It operated within the confines of the law. Nixon needed a mechanism that operated outside the law. He needed men who understood black bag operations. He needed burglars. He needed wiretappers. He needed exactly the kind of men Howard Hughes had been employing for 30 years. The Nixon administration created a covert investigations unit. They were officially called the White House Special Investigations Unit. Informally, they were known as the Plumbers. Their mandate was to stop leaks and destroy the president's enemies. The men recruited to run this unit were not politicians. They were intelligence veterans. E. Howard Hunt was a career CIA officer who had organized coups in Latin America. G. Gordon Liddy was a former FBI agent known for his extreme fanatical dedication to the mission. These were men who viewed the law as an obstacle to be circumvented. They viewed breaking and entering as a standard operational procedure. They were the government equivalent of the private security force Hughes had built. The White House was about to deploy a clandestine hit squad against a domestic political opponent. The target was explicitly hairy. They were not going after the Democratic presidential candidate. They were going after the chairman. They were going after Larry O'Brien. The mission objective was intelligence gathering. They needed to find the Hughes files. They needed to know what O'Brien had in his desk. They needed to know who O'Brien was talking to on the telephone. Nixon's re-election committee authorized a massive budget for the operation. They approved the purchase of advanced electronic surveillance equipment. They approved the hiring of lockpicks and ex-CIA operatives. They were funding a corporate espionage operation directed at the heart of the American democratic system. The target location was a massive modern office and residential complex situated on the banks of the Potomac River. It was a symbol of Washington prestige. The Democratic National Committee occupied a suite of offices on the 6th floor. The building was called the Watergate. The men assembling the burglary team were completely unaware that they were about to walk into a trap of their own making. They believed they were protecting the president. They did not realize they were the final fatal output of a surveillance culture that had been festering for decades. Howard Hughes had proven that you could bug a movie star and get away with it. He had proven you could bribe a politician and get away with it. The men working for Nixon believed they could bug the opposition party and get away with it. They suffered from the arrogance of unchecked power. The Hughes cash sitting in Florida was the hidden leverage driving the crisis. It was the original sin that drove the paranoia. Nixon's absolute terror of the Hughes connection forced him to authorize an illegal operation that would leave a trail of evidence leading directly back to the Oval Office. The billionaire who had locked himself away from the world had inadvertently set the world on fire. Hughes did not order the break-in. He did not know it was happening. He was sitting in a darkened room, terrified of dust mites, entirely disconnected from reality. But the machine he had built, the culture of paranoia he had funded, and the dark money he had dispersed were the invisible hands pushing the burglars toward the glass doors of the Watergate complex. The blueprint Hughes designed for the shadows was about to be tested in the glaring light of Washington. The untraceable casino cash had finally hit the public record. The men in the shadows were preparing their tools. They checked their lockpicks. They tested their radios. They loaded the listening devices into their bags. They waited for the sun to go down over Washington. Clear's throat, the air in Washington on the night of June 17, 1972, was thick with humidity and the quiet hum of a sleeping capital. 5 men dressed in business suits stood in the stairwell of the Watergate complex. They wore surgical gloves. They carried lockpicks, walkie-talkies, 40 rolls of unexposed film, and electronic listening devices. They were not common thieves. They were political operatives executing a black bag mission to secure the survival of the executive branch. Their objective was located on the 6th floor. They were targeting the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee. Specifically, they were targeting the office and the telephone of Larry O'Brien. They were there to plant microphones and photograph documents. They were looking for the ghost of Howard Hughes. Richard Nixon believed O'Brien held the key to his destruction. Nixon was terrified that O'Brien possessed proof of the $100,000 in illicit casino cash sitting in a safety deposit box in Florida. The president had authorized a black bag operation against a domestic political rival to neutralize a threat that existed entirely in his own mind. O'Brien did not have a blackmail dossier. O'Brien did not have the Hughes files. The burglars were hunting a phantom. They were risking the survival of the executive branch to steal secrets that simply did not exist. The operation was flawed from the beginning. It suffered from the arrogance of men who believed they were immune to consequences. They operated under the assumption that working for the highest power in the land granted them invisibility. It was the same arrogant assumption that had fueled Howard Hughes when he ordered the wiretapping of Hollywood actresses decades earlier. Hughes believed his wealth placed him above the law. Nixon believed his office placed him above the law. Both men relied on operatives who shared this fatal misconception. A young security guard named Frank Wills was making his rounds in the basement of the Watergate complex. He noticed a piece of duct tape covering the latch of a stairwell door. The tape was placed there by the burglars to keep the door from locking behind them. It was a sloppy, amateur mistake. Wills removed the tape and continued his patrol. When he returned an hour later, a new piece of tape had been placed over the latch. Wills did not hesitate. He walked to a telephone and called the police. An unmarked cruiser arrived. Plainclothes officers entered the building. They drew their weapons. They moved up the stairwell. They swept the 6th floor. They found Th. E5 burglars hiding behind a partition in the DNC offices. The men surrendered without a fight. They raised their hands, their pockets stuffed with sequential $100 bills. The lock clicked. The handcuffs tightened. The executive branch was caught in its own trap. When the news reached the White House, the reaction was not moral outrage. It was tactical panic. The men arrested were not anonymous criminals. One of them, James McCord, was the security director for the committee to re-elect the president. The sequential $100 bills found in their pockets were traced directly back to a Nixon campaign slush fund. The connection was undeniable. The burglars were tied to the Oval Office. Nixon did not sleep. He paced the floor. He summoned his closest advisors. The crisis was not the burglary itself. The burglary was a botched intelligence-gathering mission. The true crisis was the motive. If the Federal Bureau of Investigation started digging into why the White House had authorized a break-in at the Democratic headquarters, they would inevitably uncover the underlying paranoia. They would uncover the fear of Larry O'Brien. They would uncover the connection to Robert Maheu. They would find Bebe Rebozo. They would find the $100,000. They would find Howard Hughes. The Hughes money was the unexploded ordnance beneath the Oval Office. The break-in was merely the symptom. Disease was the culture of dark money and illicit surveillance that Hughes had pioneered. Nixon realized he was trapped in a chain reaction of his own making. He had to contain the investigation. He had to sever the link between the burglars and the White House before the FBI followed the money back to the Hughes transaction. The cover-up commenced. It was an exercise in brute force political survival. Nixon authorized the payment of hundreds of thousands of dollars in hush money to the jailed burglars. He wanted to buy their silence. He wanted them to plead guilty, take the prison sentences, and keep their mouths shut about who had ordered the mission. He was using dirty money to cover up a crime motivated by the fear of dirty money. It was a vicious, inescapable cycle. He attempted to leverage the Central Intelligence Agency to block the FBI investigation. He instructed his chief of staff to tell the CIA director that the Watergate break-in was a matter of national security. A covert operation that the FBI needed to ignore. Nixon was trying to use the intelligence community as a personal shield, mirroring the exact tactic Hughes had used when he partnered with the CIA to build the Glommer Explorer. Hughes had used the CIA to hide a salvage operation. Nixon was trying to use the CIA to hide a burglary. But the American political system is not a Hollywood film studio. Nixon could not control the narrative the way Hughes had controlled the trade papers in Los Angeles. When Lana Turner was suffocating under the weight of Hughes's surveillance, there was no independent press to investigate her plight. The studio bosses and the columnists were all compromised. Washington was different. Washington had reporters who did not work for the administration. Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, two young journalists at the Washington Post, began pulling at the threads of the burglary. They followed the money. They tracked the sequential bills from the burglars' pockets to a Mexican bank and then back to the Nixon campaign. They cultivated sources inside the FBI. They chipped away at the wall of denial erected by the White House press secretary. They did not know about Howard Hughes. They did not know about the original $100,000 in Key Biscayne, but they knew the administration was lying. The pressure on the White House became crushing. The hush money payments required constant maintenance. The burglars began to panic as they faced the reality of long prison sentences. The loyalty of the conspirators began to fracture. The private surveillance state that Nixon had built to protect himself was collapsing under the weight of public scrutiny. The irony was absolute and merciless. Nixon was destroyed by the very tools he used to assert control. He had ordered the installation of a voice-activated taping system in the Oval Office. He wanted a perfect, indisputable record of every conversation to protect himself against his perceived enemies. He bugged his own sanctuary. He recorded his own crimes. When the existence of the taping system was revealed during the Senate Watergate hearings, the battle shifted. The investigators no longer needed to rely on the testimony of compromised witnesses. They demanded the tapes. Nixon fought to keep them hidden. He claimed executive privilege. He fired the special prosecutor in a desperate purge known as the Saturday Night Massacre. He behaved like a cornered tyrant. He behaved exactly like a man who knows his own voice will convict him. The Supreme Court ordered the release of the tapes. The audio recordings were a devastating exposure of the presidential mind. The public did not hear a statesman discussing policy. They heard a paranoid, vindictive man orchestrating a criminal conspiracy. They heard Nixon discussing hush money. They heard him ordering the CIA to impede the FBI. They heard the raw, unfiltered mechanics of corruption. The tapes revealed a man who shared the exact psychological profile of Howard Hughes. They were both men who believed that trust was a weakness and surveillance was the only guarantee of loyalty. They both believed that everyone was for sale. They both isolated themselves behind walls of security, terrified of a world they could not manipulate. Lana Turner had experienced this specific brand of terror 2 decades earlier. She had lived in a house where the walls listened and the staff reported her movements. She had been subjected to the same ruthless demand for total control. Hughes had pioneered the methodology of the shadow state on a micro level. He proved that an individual could be broken and managed through the strategic application of wealth and wiretaps. Nixon attempted to apply that exact methodology on a macro level to the American democratic system. The failure of the Watergate cover-up proved that the Hughes model of absolute control was fundamentally incompatible with a free society. Hughes operated in the shadows of the private sector, shielded by corporate lawyers and non-disclosure agreements. Nixon operated in the glaring light of public office. The tactics of the casting couch and the private investigator's bug could not withstand the scrutiny of a federal judge and a free press. The walls closed in on the Oval Office. The House Judiciary Committee drafted articles of impeachment. Republican senators traveled to the White House to tell the president that his support had vanished. Faced certain conviction and removal from office. The leverage was gone. The hush money had failed. The tapes had betrayed him. Clear as throat, on August 8, 1974, Richard Nixon addressed the nation from the Oval Office. He did not confess to the crimes. He did not apologize for the break-in or the cover-up. He simply stated that he no longer had a strong enough political base to continue in office. The following morning, he boarded a helicopter on the south lawn of the White House. He raised his arms in a final, defiant gesture. The helicopter lifted off, carrying the disgraced president into exile. Clear as throat, the resignation of Richard Nixon was the detonation of the explosive charge planted years earlier in Las Vegas. The $100,000 that Hughes had handed over in a briefcase had acted as a slow-acting poison. It infected the mind of the president. It generated the fear that led to the creation of the plumbers. It necessitated the burglary at the Watergate. It demanded the cover-up that ultimately destroyed the administration. Howard Hughes never faced a congressional committee. He was never indicted for his role in funding the paranoia that crippled the nation. Clear's throat. He remained locked in his hotel penthouse, entirely insulated from the political earthquake he had helped trigger. He was sitting in the dark, watching the same movies on a continuous loop, terrified of microscopic germs while ignoring the massive systemic corruption he had unleashed upon the country. The apparatus of control did not change, only the target did. The same obsession that wired a microphone into a bedside lamp eventually funded the break-in at the Watergate. It was never about romance, and it was never about politics. It was always about paranoia. The evolution was complete. The paranoia had achieved its ultimate expression. The disease of absolute control had run its course, leaving behind a trail of ruined careers, shattered public trust, and a nation forever changed by the realization that the men in power were just as fearful and corruptible as the men in the shadows. Richard Nixon walked the beaches of San Clemente a disgraced exile. He had surrendered the most powerful office on earth to avoid a criminal trial. He was a casualty of his own engineered paranoia. But the man who wrote the original blueprint for that paranoia never faced a judge. Howard Hughes did not watch the resignation on television. He did not read the congressional reports detailing the illicit campaign funds or the wiretaps. He remained entirely disconnected from the political collapse he had helped finance. He was busy dying in a prison of his own construction. The final years of Howard Hughes are a study in the grotesque reality of absolute power. He possessed a net worth exceeding $2 billion. He owned airlines, casinos, defense contracting firms, and massive tracts of real estate. Yet his physical existence was reduced to a dark, sterile box. He moved his operation from Las Vegas to the Bahamas, then to Nicaragua, then to London, and finally to Acapulco. The locations changed, but the room remained exactal. Why the same? The windows were permanently sealed and covered with heavy blackout drapes. The sunlight was banished. The air was filtered. The temperature was strictly regulated. He was terrified of the outside world. He believed microscopic pathogens were actively conspiring to kill him. Clear's throat. He believed assassins were waiting in the hallways. To protect himself, he surrounded his bed with a private security force known as the Mormon Mafia. He hired these men specifically because their religious tenets forbade alcohol and tobacco. He believed this made them pure. He believed it made them incorruptible. He failed to realize the fundamental trap of his own system. By hiring men to completely isolate him from humanity, he handed them total control over his life. The guards became his wardens. They controlled who spoke to him. They controlled what documents he signed. They controlled his supply of drugs. Hughes was severely addicted to codeine and Valium. The man who had once dictated the schedules of Hollywood stars and manipulated the policies of the Pentagon was now begging his own employees for narcotic injections. His body became a roadmap of his addiction. He Clear's throat, injected the drugs directly into his muscles. The needles often broke off under his skin. He left them there. The contrast between his global influence and his physical decay was absolute. Hughes Aircraft Company was building satellites that orbited the Earth and missiles that guarded the American perimeter. Simultaneously, the owner of the company was lying naked on a bed, his hair hanging down to his waist. He refused to cut his fingernails or toenails. They grew into thick yellowed claws. He weighed less than 90 lb. He was a skeletal phantom, a billionaire starving to death in the middle of a luxury resort. He had spent his entire life trying to buy control. He bought the silence of the press. He bought the loyalty of politicians. He bought the freedom of actresses, but he could not buy immunity from his own mind. The surveillance state he built to monitor Lana Turner was turned inward. He monitored his own bodily functions with obsessive terror. He logged his temperature. He measured his fluid intake. He lived in a state of perpetual agonizing vigilance. The machine he designed to crush the autonomy of others had successfully crushed him. His empire ran on autopilot. Executives he had never met signed contracts he would never read. The shadow government he helped establish continued to operate in Washington. Defense budgets swelled, covert operations were funded. The legacy of dark money in politics, the system of using corporate wealth to bypass democratic oversight, became permanently embedded in the American political system. Hughes had proven the concept. He demonstrated that extreme wealth could successfully privatize the mechanics of a totalitarian state. Future generations of power brokers simply refined his methods. The end came in the spring of 1976. Hughes suffered kidney failure in his darkened penthouse in Acapulco. His heart began to give out. The Mormon guards panicked. They could not let the richest man in the world die in a Mexican hotel room. They chartered a private jet. They carried his emaciated body onto the aircraft. They directed the pilot to fly to the Methodist Hospital in Houston, Texas. It was a frantic, desperate flight. Hughes was placed on a stretcher in the cabin of the airplane. The machinery of aviation had made him a legend. He had set speed records. He had designed revolutionary aircraft. He had owned trans-world airlines. It was fitting that his final moments were spent in the sky. He died somewhere over the Gulf of Mexico on April 5, 1976. When the plane landed in Houston, the medical personnel did not recognize the corpse. The man on the stretcher looked like a destitute vagrant. He was unwashed, skeletal, and covered in bedsores. The hospital authorities called the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The FBI had to roll the dead man's fingers in ink and match the prints against a decades-old file to confirm that this broken shell was indeed Howard Robart Hughes, Jr. The man who tried to own the world died without a face the world could recognize. Lana Turner outlived her captor by nearly 2 decades. She survived the prototype of his private surveillance state and reclaimed her identity. Hughes was not so fortunate. He had spent his life and billions of dollars building a cage to monitor the world, but the tragic irony of absolute control is inescapable. Nixon fell because he brought those tactics into the light. Hughes survived by staying in the dark, only to die a prisoner of his own insurmountable paranoia. The man who spent billions building a cage to monitor the world died alone inside it.